The roar of motorcycles shattered the quiet as the fire wolves descended, mocking James Carter and threatening to burn his home to the ground. Shade, their arrogant leader, smirked, certain the quiet artist was powerless. What they didn't know was that James held a secret, one that would turn their triumph into their greatest regret. What happened next would shock them all. But let's start at the beginning. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest, a small house stood in tranquil isolation. The home belonged to James Carter, a reclusive artist in his early 60s, whose days were spent creating abstract paintings in his sunlit studio. Though quiet and seemingly unremarkable, James's workspace housed a peculiar corner filled with sketches far removed from his usual art. Detailed maps, strategic layouts, and complex diagrams. Locals saw James as a harmless eccentric, preferring solitude over social calls. Few knew him well, and even fewer dared to disturb his peace. That is, until one fateful evening when tranquility was shattered. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, the sound breaking the serene hush of the evening. A group of leather-clad bikers, known as the Fire Wolves, roared up to James's gate. Their leader, a tall, imposing man with a shaved head and a smug grin, dismounted first. He called himself Shade. "Hey, old man," Shade barked, leaning casually against his bike. "This your little slice of heaven?" James stepped out onto his porch, his demeanor calm as ever. In his hand, he held a painter's palette dotted with vibrant colors. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" James asked, his tone polite yet tinged with subtle irony. Shade exchanged a grin with one of his crew before casually gesturing toward James's garden. "Looks like you're all alone out here. We're just checking to see if you got room for some new neighbors." Without waiting for an answer, one biker kicked over the mailbox, sending it clattering to the ground. Another stepped forward and knocked over a ceramic flower pot, the bright flowers spilling across the porch. James's fingers tightened on his palette, his knuckles whitening, but his face remained unreadable. "You know," he said evenly, "some people call knocking on the door a lost art." Shade ignored the jab and revved his bike, its tires leaving ugly scars across the garden beds as he rode a short circle. The rest of the group laughed and joined in, their bikes chewing up the carefully tended greenery. Shade stopped abruptly in front of James, his grin gone. "You've got until tomorrow night to pack up and get out," he growled, "or this place goes up in flames." James tilted his head, his eyes scanning Shade and his crew with an expression that could only be described as mild curiosity. "Flames, you say? I've always admired fire. It's so revealing," James said, his words carrying an edge Shade didn't quite catch. The bikers laughed, their leader turning away with a dismissive wave. "Enjoy your last of the night, old man," Shade called over his shoulder as the group roared away into the fading light. James stood there a moment longer, surveying the damage to his garden. With a small sigh, he set the palette down on a table and retrieved a notebook from inside. As he flipped on through pages filled with detailed sketches and annotations, his expression hardened ever so slightly. "Time to see if they're as bold as they think they are," James muttered to himself before heading inside, locking the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click. The morning sun filtered through the trees as James methodically swept the remains of his garden. The mailbox lay in a crumpled heap nearby, and the once vibrant flower beds were now a patchwork of tire tracks and scattered soil. Despite the destruction, James's movements were unhurried, his expression calm. The tranquility didn't last. The rumble of engines signaled the return of the fire wolves. This time, the bikers were armed not with words, but with action. Shade led the pack, a smug grin plastered across his face as he dismounted his bike, holding a red gasoline canister in one hand. "Morning, Picasso," Shade called out mockingly. "Thought we'd drop by for some redecorating." James glanced up from his broom, one eyebrow raised. "Ah, the art critics are back. I hope you're here to apologize for last night's performance. It was a bit heavy-handed." Shade's grin faltered for a moment before he tipped the canister, splashing gasoline onto the dry grass surrounding the house. The acrid smell filled the air as the other bikers followed suit, forming a perimeter around James's home. "Warned you, old man," Shade growled. "This is what happens when you don't listen." James opened his mouth to speak, but his words were drowned out by the roar of laughter from the group. They reveled in the destruction, their loud jeers cutting through the morning air. One of the bikers lit a match and tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked ground. Flames erupted, licking hungrily at the wooden walls of the house. The fire spread quickly, engulfing the structure in a cacophony of crackling wood and billowing smoke. James stood a safe distance away, his face expressionless as he watched his home burn. But for a fleeting moment, his eyes betrayed a glimmer of pain. This wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, a place where years of his life and creativity were woven into every corner. The bikers lounged in the clearing near James's scorched property, their laughter ringing through the air as they toasted their so-called victory. Shade leaned back against his bike, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "That'll teach the old man not to mess with us," he said, tipping his bottle in a mock salute toward the forest. Their revelry was interrupted by the low hum of an approaching vehicle. A sleek, black SUV rolled into view, its polished exterior gleaming ominously in the sunlight. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the celebratory mood dimming. The SUV came to a halt, and three men stepped out. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits, their expressions unreadable. The leader, a tall man with piercing eyes, surveyed the group with an air of authority that silenced even the most boisterous biker. "Which one of you is in charge here?" the man asked, his voice calm but commanding. Shade straightened up, his bravado returning. "That'd be me. Who's asking?" he said, crossing his arms in defiance. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and produced a badge. "Special Agent Daniels, National Security Agency." Shade's smirk faltered. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone a mix of irritation and unease. Daniels' gaze hardened. "We're looking for Mr. James Carter." Shade blinked, his mind racing. "The old guy? Yeah, we, had a little disagreement. He's probably sulking in the woods somewhere," Shade said with a forced chuckle. Daniels' jaw tightened as he took a step closer. "That old guy is one of our top defense analysts. His work has prevented attacks that could have cost countless lives," Daniels said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "And you just burned down a federal asset." The bikers stared at him, their confidence evaporating. "Wait a second," Shade stammered, his voice rising. "We didn't know." "Ignorance isn't a defense," Daniels interrupted sharply. "You're now under investigation for arson, destruction of property, and endangering national security." Before Shade could respond, the sound of footsteps drew everyone's attention. Emerging from the shadows of the forest, James Carter stepped into view. But this wasn't the quiet, unassuming artist they had taunted. Dressed in a black jacket adorned with the emblem of the NSA, his posture exuded authority. His gaze locked onto Shade with a mixture of calm and steely resolve. "Well, Shade," James said, his voice carrying a quiet strength, "it seems you've managed to turn a simple misunderstanding into a federal offense. Bravo." The bikers stood frozen, their earlier confidence now replaced with visible dread. Shade tried to muster his defiance. "Look, we didn't mean any harm." James raised a hand, silencing him. "You've made your choices," he said, his tone even. "Now it's time to face the consequences." Daniels turned to his team and gave a curt nod. Two agents stepped forward, their expressions stern as they began taking statements and collecting evidence. As Shade stumbled over his words, James leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only the biker could hear. "Next time you decide to pick a fight," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "make sure you know who you're dealing with." James straightened, turning back toward the SUV. As he climbed in, the crowd of onlookers erupted into quiet applause, some even cheering as they captured the scene on their phones. Shade and his crew were left standing in stunned silence, their bravado stripped away under the weight of their actions. The sound of sirens pierced the air as black SUVs and police cruisers surrounded the scene. Uniformed officers and agents moved swiftly, encircling the bikers who now looked like cornered prey. Shade, the once boastful leader, visibly shook as he tried to maintain his composure. One agent, a tall man with a sharp gaze, couldn't help but smirk at the sight. "Who would have thought the tough guy act would crumble so fast?" he said, gesturing to Shade's trembling hand. "Guess setting fire to a federal asset wasn't your brightest move." The onlookers, who had been cautiously filming from a distance, now erupted into applause and cheers. Phones recorded every detail as the bikers were handcuffed and seated on the ground. Shade's attempts at defiance came out as a stammer. You'll regret this," he blurted, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd's mocking laughter. James stood a few steps away, his face unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. His calm demeanor seemed unshaken, even as the agents efficiently dismantled the biker's false sense of superiority. One officer approached him, offering a respectful nod. "Good work, Mr. Carter," the officer said. James gave a small nod in return, but remained silent. Another agent stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "What's next, sir?" he asked. James allowed a faint smile to cross his face, a rare display of emotion amidst the chaos. "First, we rebuild," he said. "Then we make sure their little club gets the attention it truly deserves." The agent grinned, jotting something down before walking back to the officers. The bikers were loaded into the waiting vehicles, their heads hung low as the crowd jeered. Shade hesitated as he was guided into a car, glancing over at James one last time. James met his gaze with a calm, steady look, saying nothing. As the last car pulled away, the crowd broke into applause. People gathered around James, some offering handshakes, others simply thanking him for standing his ground. A young boy ran up, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Mr. Carter, you're like a superhero," the boy said, his eyes wide with admiration. James crouched slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes," he said with a faint smile. "Sometimes they even wear paint-covered shirts." The boy laughed, running back to his mother, who was recording every moment. In the days that followed, James's story spread across the internet and news outlets like wildfire. The tale of the quiet artist who stood up to a gang of bikers and turned the tables became a viral sensation. Memes and hashtags celebrated his calm demeanor and cleverness, while local reporters dubbed him the unlikely hero. But for James, the attention was secondary. Standing before the charred remains of his house, he set up a fresh canvas on an easel. With deliberate strokes, he began painting a phoenix rising from flames, a vivid reminder of resilience and renewal. The community rallied around him. Neighbors brought supplies, tools, and even meals, while strangers from across the city came to help rebuild his home. The once empty property buzzed with activity as the garden was replanted and the house began to take shape again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James stood in his restored garden. He surveyed the vibrant colors of the flowers, the laughter of volunteers, and the hum of life that now filled the space. He looked down at his painting, a nearly finished masterpiece of fire transforming into hope. With a quiet chuckle, he muttered to himself, "Sometimes you need a little fire to light the way." The crowd behind him erupted into applause as they caught sight of the painting. James turned, giving them a nod of gratitude before stepping back into his studio, ready to begin the next chapter of his life.